Ciò che ho voglia di mostrarvi in questo video è qualcosa di completamente diverso da quello che ho fatto fino adesso in questo canale. Sinceramente, non ho molte speranze né fiducia che molti di voi possano comprendere, accettare o capire quanto sia significativo, radicalmente importante e stravolgente per la nostra mentalità e per ciò che ci è stato insegnato da quando siamo bambini, ciò che ci è stato fatto credere riguardo a questo mondo e alla storia lineare della nostra specie. Questi dati, che sono emersi ormai inconfutabili negli ultimi 10 anni, ancora purtroppo non sono accettati dalla comunità scientifica. I geologi, gli astrologi, le persone che stanno cercando di ricostruire i tasselli della nostra storia, hanno scoperto che forse non è così lineare e il progresso dell'umanità non è avvenuto così gradualmente come l'abbiamo immaginato noi. A quanto pare, l'umanità aveva già intrapreso 13.000-14.000 anni fa un percorso che li stava portando verso uno stato estremamente avanzato, magari non ai livelli in cui siamo oggi, e che purtroppo è stato spazzato via e ha dovuto subire un enorme reset ripartendo praticamente da zero. L'80-90% dell'intera razza umana è stata sterminata durante un enorme cataclisma, una cometa che ha colpito delle calotte di ghiaccio a nord dell'America, vicino al Canada, che ha fatto distaccare enormi quantità di acqua che hanno travolto il continente e hanno innalzato i livelli degli oceani di circa 100 metri. Questo ha portato alla leggenda di Atlantide, altre leggende che abbiamo ritenuto sempre essere false, ma a quanto pare, studiando le erosioni del terreno e guardando con i nostri occhi ciò che abbiamo trovato, possiamo comprendere che molte delle sculture e delle enormi costruzioni, come le piramidi o altri siti, non erano stati costruiti di recente come abbiamo immaginato, non poche migliaia di anni fa, ma in realtà gli egizi e quei paesi che abitavano le piramidi si sono già trovati queste enormi strutture perché risalivano delle epoche di 13-14 mila anni fa, prima che l'umanità ebbe un enorme reset dato da un cataclisma naturale. Probabilmente alcune delle tracce, delle prove di queste antiche civiltà sono ancora sommerse sotto agli oceani. Fortunatamente ci sono dei posti che sono stati dissotterrati come Göbekli Tepe, che vi consiglio di andare a vedere. Il video che vedrete adesso è una raccolta mia personale delle clip più interessanti che spiegano meglio il fenomeno accaduto. Mi auguro che lo vediate senza avere pregiudizi o usando mente emotiva. Tenete la mente aperta, usate la vostra saggezza interiore, la vostra razionalità e cercate di comprendere che forse non è tutto facile, lineare, semplice e chiaro come ci hanno sempre voluto far credere. A quanto pare la nostra storia e questo pianeta è più antico, complesso e complicato e misterioso di quanto avessimo mai immaginato. Buona visione.
That got this all started. That fringe one that respectable scientists may not want to venture into. Well, it was this. A researcher named Jim Allison noticed that a significant number of ancient sites around the world, some of the oldest, most mysterious structures, all line up on a single circle around the Earth, a straight line. When you put a 2-day orbit over this exact place, it's not an exact circle, it's got slightly a potato chip shape to it, but it lines up pretty closely. Let's hop aboard a 2-day orbit satellite and take a tour of all these ancient sites. We start over the most famous megalithic site, the Great Pyramids, with their mysterious chambers, hidden tunnels, and of course the Sphinx. A little bit later, we cross the Sahara, we cross the Atlantic Ocean, we cross over the Amazon basin, and we come to Machu Picchu with its mysterious stone structures, and Ollantaytambo, and all the other ancient sites around Cusco. Then we fly past the plain of Nazca with its mysterious etched drawings in the floor of the desert. Of course, we're 60,000 kilometers up, so if we want to see those shapes, we got to have a pretty good telescope. We keep going across the Pacific. 4,000 kilometers, we cross directly over Easter Island with its gigantic heads, the moai figures. Actually, they're full figures that are buried down into the ground. Continuing on across the Pacific, we come back up over the equator. We fly up over Cambodia and the ancient temples of Preah and Angkor Wat. Continuing on up into Asia, we fly over India to Pakistan, to the site of Mohenjo-Daro, one of the oldest Western civilization locations, with its script that has still not been decoded because it's so old and remote from us. We continue on over the Middle East, past Persepolis, and the great buildings at Ur, and then we continue on over Petra with its amazing stone structures dug into the walls, and then it brings us back to the Great Pyramids, right where we started. So obviously not all ancient sites are on this circle. Stonehenge, the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, all sorts of sites in China, Africa, Asia, Central America. But the sites that are on the circle have a lot of things in common. One, they have some of the largest stonework humans have ever done. Huge blocks that we wouldn't realistically try to move today. Two, the style of the stonework is precisely cut. They fit together. You cannot fit a knife blade in between some of these rocks. And then look at Easter Island in specific. The big moai figures get most of the attention. There's hundreds of them. But there are also walls that appear to be some of the oldest things on Easter Island, made by humans. The walls are made of basalt, an extremely hard stone. They match the style of construction at Machu Picchu, 4,000 kilometers away across the Pacific, also made of basalt. Then there's these mysterious knobs and scoops. Many on the pyramids, other Egyptian sites, many all over South America. What are those knobs for? How were they made? Why did they go to the effort of putting that in? We don't know. The scooping, it looks like it was mashed potatoes and somebody came along with a trowel and just scooped out the rock. We don't know. Then there's the precision stonework, perfectly flat surfaces, things that you would take to a machine shop and they would grind with diamond. We can't figure out how this could have been done with bronze or iron tools. Okay, want to get a little bit weirder? There are cultures around the world that have the bird man, the fish man. Asia's got them, South America's got them, and they have this other feature, the handbag of the gods. Why? How? All around the world. The handbag of the gods is also found in India and Indonesia, and most recently at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which has been buried for 10,000 years at least, which means the handbag has been around for at least that time. It wasn't added by people later on. Okay, now I'm not here to invoke ancient astronauts or space aliens. To me, that doesn't answer anything. It's like putting a bumper sticker on it, but I want to read the book. Where did all this come from? Who created this? I don't want to take anything away from the ancient peoples who did this work. I want to know more about them. I want to know how they did it, when they did it, and I want to give them full credit for their great work. So what do? Well, we get out our science toolkit. First thing, what's our theory? Well, researchers who look into this question our traditional story of the ancient human past, where we go from a long period of hunter-gatherers up to settling down and doing agriculture, and eventually moving into city-states. Researchers suspect, and there is good evidence for, 13,000 years ago there was a more advanced form of human civilization. How advanced is hard to say, but we know they could do stuff with stone that we really cannot. And then what happened? Suddenly there was a catastrophe. Something terrible happened. The oceans rose, temperatures dropped, populations were wiped out, cities were abandoned. Time goes by, civilization recovers, we get into hunter-gatherer mode, we get into agriculture, city-states. Okay, so it's a story, right? It's a good story? Maybe, maybe not. But what does the science tell us? Well, to begin with, we have great data showing the oceans were 100 meters lower 15,000 years ago. 100 meters, 330 feet. That means the ancient coastlines and islands are now completely submerged. Secondly, Greenland ice cores and mid-Atlantic sediment samples show us that there was a sudden drop in temperature, and it lasted for 1,000 years or so around the world. Thirdly, the male DNA has clues. Around the world, the diversity of the male DNA drops precipitously, again, around 13,000 years ago. It wasn't just here or there, it was around the world. A lot of men were not passing on their DNA to future generations. That declined, and then it began to recover. So what could have happened that could explain all of these things? Well, we have evidence that something hit North America, a comet or a meteorite. It left very distinctive particles all over the hemisphere. It set a lot of stuff on fire because there's very distinctive soot and ash particles found right there as well. We have seen 500,000 impact craters, ranging from New Jersey all the way down to Alabama, like a giant cosmic shotgun blast hit our planet. So there's hard work to be done. We need more. We need more data, more evidence. We need to begin thinking science fiction ideas and engineering them into science fact. We need to see how we can do what we did with the airplane, where we can now fly better than any bird, or the submarine, where we can swim better than any fish, or now rockets that can fly into space and come back and land on Earth and be reused, unlike any animal ever. Check out this map. The light blue shows the continental shelf. Most of that area was land 15,000 years ago. What might be out there? We need to make a bunch of cheap drones with some kind of technology on board that we can send swimming out under the oceans, looking for ancient sites, roadways, seabed relics that we've overlooked for thousands of years. Or what about these big rocks that have been sitting next to each other for an unknown amount of time? Is there some technique we can develop that will let us know how long they've been sitting there? Have cosmic rays been zipping through them, making little traces that we could read and count up and tell us precisely how old they are? Or what about surfaces? We make a surface on a stone. What begins to change? Does something in the atmosphere sink into the stone? Does something in the stone come out over time at a measured rate that we can also count up and figure out a time on these amazing ancient artifacts? Or there's this big pile of stones in Egypt, 1 million stones piled up. What are they doing to the ground underneath? Have they been blocking it from something from the sun? Can we compare what's underneath the pyramids to what's over here, not covered up for that period of time? Because the Egyptian records don't really tell us when the pyramids were built. We're going to have to find that out. Sometimes I feel like I'm still that 4-year-old looking at the earth, trying to figure out how the pieces fit together. One of my heroes, Carl Sagan, reminds us that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. To that I would add that extraordinary evidence deserves extraordinary investigation. And I'm quite certain that if we use our science and our human best thinking abilities, and we do the hard work and spend the money, find the answers, we're going to learn more about who we are, where we came from, and where we might be able to go. And I think building the best possible future is doable if we know what happened in our past. So let's do it. Thank you.
Ancestor of the mammalian line was skulking in the primeval forests, going nowhere. Once the dinosaurs were cleared out of the way, however, that shrew began to evolve. And 65 million years later, here we are, the new rulers of the world. So at risk of oversimplification, what happened 65 million years ago was so huge that it turned dinosaurs into chickens and shrews into human beings. It's now universally agreed that the cataclysm was caused by a 6-mile wide chunk of rock from outer space, hitting the Earth at about 70,000 miles an hour. Scientists are divided on whether the culprit was an asteroid or a comet, but whether asteroid or comet, it left a distinct fingerprint in the Earth. A layer of ash and soot marking the KT boundary, the Cretaceous-Tertiary boundary, that is filled with iridium, carbon microspherules, nanodiamonds, melt glass similar to trinitite, and other minerals subjected to huge temperatures in excess of 2,200 degrees centigrade, the boiling point of quartz, across enormous areas of the Earth's surface. These are the characteristic chemical signatures of a colossal cosmic impact. Nothing else can account for them. They're referred to as impact proxies. Lewis and Walter Alvarez were the father-son team who revealed the true nature of the KT event. For more than a decade, they were subjected to quite vicious attacks from other scientists who refused to accept the evidence of the impact proxies. Only when the crater left by the impact was found deeply buried beneath the Gulf of Mexico did the criticism cease. The Alvarez case for a cosmic impact and related extinction 65 million years ago is now regarded as confirmed. Keep this in mind while I introduce you to the work of another group of highly credentialed scientists. There are more than 30 members of their team. Their leading lights shown in this slide include Jim Kennett, Alan West, Richard Firestone, James Whittaker, and Elbert Goodyear. They initially joined forces to investigate a mystery of the closing millennia of the last ice age. The last glacial maximum, if you look at the chart, was reached 21,000 years ago. After that, temperatures began to warm. But then suddenly, with ice sheets still 2 kilometers deep on top of North America and Northern Europe, there was a striking and dramatic plunge in temperatures, a short, sharp deep freeze that lasted from roughly 12,800 to 11,600 years ago. This period of extreme and anomalous cold is known to geologists as the Younger Dryas. The mystery is what caused it. It turns out that precisely at the Younger Dryas boundary, there's a layer of ash and soot in the soil, referred to as the black mat, distributed across a vast area of the Earth's surface and filled with abundances of the same impact proxies that bear witness to the KT event. Unlike the KT event, however, the Younger Dryas cataclysm is astonishingly recent, just 12,800 years ago. Initially, the team put the event at 12,900 years ago, but with subsequent research, that date has been refined down to 12,800 years ago. This is the first paper published by the Younger Dryas impact team. It appeared in PNAS, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, in October 2007. The headline speaks for itself. Evidence for extraterrestrial impact 12,900 years ago that contributed to megafaunal extinctions and the Younger Dryas cooling. I'll show you a few more of the team's papers, just to make the point that this is mainstream, peer-reviewed science we're dealing with here, not the lunatic fringe. PNAS 2009, shock-synthesized hexagonal diamonds in Younger Dryas boundary sediments. Very high temperature impact melt products as evidence for cosmic airbursts and impacts 12,900 years ago. Evidence from Mexico. Evidence from the Greenland ice cores. Evidence for deposition of 10 million tons of impact spherules across 4 continents 12,800 years ago. Here's the Journal of Geology, 5th of September 2014. Nanodiamond-rich layer across 3 continents, consistent with major cosmic impact 12,800 years ago. Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, July 2015. The evidence presented in this paper rules out any possibility that the impact proxies in the Younger Dryas layer were laid down gradually, say over periods of hundreds of years. The Bayesian chronological analysis shows that the cataclysm was unleashed synchronously, in a geological instant, effectively a single dreadful day and night. Moreover, the evidence tracks the fingerprint of the cataclysm across more than 50 million square kilometers of the Earth's surface. Multiple bolides, thought to be fragments from a giant disintegrating comet, came in on a trajectory from northwest to southeast. The primary impacts were on the North American ice cap, then still more than 2 kilometers deep. There were further impacts on the Northern European ice cap, and the furthest east evidence for the impacts has so far been traced is Syria. Because the primary impacts were on the North American ice cap, it's been difficult to find craters, since the craters were transient, excavated in 2-kilometer deep ice that has subsequently melted away. Despite the abundant evidence of the impact proxies, the absence of craters has exposed the team to the same kind of attacks that Lewis and Walter Alvarez suffered. In the last couple of years, however, craters have been identified in areas beyond the edge of the former ice cap, or where the ice cover was thin. These craters are the final pieces of the puzzle that should settle the debate. 12,800 years ago, multiple fragments of a giant disintegrating comet hit the Earth, with the epicenter of the cataclysm on the North American ice cap. Why did the impacts 12,800 years ago cause the worldwide plunge in temperatures witnessed at the beginning of the Younger Dryas? The best explanation is that floods of icy meltwater released by the heat and kinetic energy of the impacts flowed off the North American ice cap and into the Atlantic Ocean, where they interrupted the Gulf Stream, a key element of the central heating system of our planet, hence the sudden and dramatic cooling. Why did the Younger Dryas end equally suddenly 11,600 years ago with a dramatic rise in temperatures? As long ago as the 1980s, the British astrophysicist Sir Fred Hoyle became intrigued by the sudden temperature rise at the end of the Younger Dryas. He proposed a comet impact in an ocean as the agency, producing not only tidal waves, but also sending a vast cloud of water vapor into the upper atmosphere where it shrouded the Earth, creating a greenhouse effect large enough to account for the dramatic warming. It's possible that further fragments from the debris stream of the same disintegrated comet that hit the Earth 12,800 years ago were involved in the events of 11,600 years ago as well. Astronomers calculate that this comet originally entered the inner solar system about 20,000 years ago and began to break up into multiple fragments. These spread out along the course of its orbit to form a torus of lethal debris that crosses the orbit of the Earth and has interacted catastrophically with human history on more than one occasion in the past 13,000 years. The science on what caused the end of the Younger Dryas 11,600 years ago is not as complete as the science on the beginning of the Younger Dryas. Whatever the agency, however, the facts on the ground are not in dispute. The Younger Dryas did end abruptly 11,600 years ago. Global temperatures soared and the remnant ice caps very rapidly collapsed into the sea, causing a dramatic pulse of sea level rise, nominated by geologists as Meltwater Pulse 1b. Is it a coincidence that 11,600 years ago, the date of Meltwater Pulse 1b is also the date that Plato gives for the destruction and submergence of Atlantis? Let's double-check Plato's date. The story he tells us was passed down to him through his family line, from his ancestor, the famous Greek lawmaker Solon, who visited Egypt around 600 BC, and there claimed to have been told the story of Atlantis by priests in the Temple of Neith at Sais in the Delta. Solon asked the priests when the disaster occurred, and they replied matter-of-factly 9,000 years ago. Remember that this was in 600 BC, and of course 9,000 years ago in 600 BC is 9,600 BC in our calendar, in other words 11,600 years ago, the precise date that modern geological science puts on Meltwater Pulse 1b and a sudden global rise in sea level. If Plato made the whole thing up, as historians tell us, then he was astonishingly on the money with 21st century science linking a global flood cataclysm to the date of 11,600 years ago. And something else, the same precise date is now being cited by archaeologists as a highly significant one, the date at which the invention of both megalithic architecture and agriculture occurred apparently for the first time in the world. The place where this happened was Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. And here I am at Göbekli Tepe with the late Professor Klaus Schmidt, who discovered the site and began excavating it for the German Archaeological Institute from the second half of the 1990s onwards. He's telling me three things. First, the megaliths of Göbekli Tepe exposed in the excavations were not covered by natural sedimentation over the course of ages. Instead, after being used for about 1,000 years, they were deliberately and meticulously buried beneath an artificial hill of earth and rubble. Indeed, the very name Göbekli Tepe in the Turkish language means pot-bellied hill. Secondly, it's this sealing of the site with no contamination by later cultures that allows archaeologists to be sure of the date of Göbekli Tepe's foundation. 11,600 years ago, which makes it 7,000 years older than Stonehenge and about 6,000 years older than the very oldest megalithic sites hitherto recognized anywhere on Earth. Thirdly, up to 50 times as much as has already been excavated at Göbekli Tepe still waits to be brought to light. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed that hundreds and hundreds of giant megalithic pillars still lie buried, making this not only the oldest, but also the largest megalithic site on Earth. And yet it just seems to pop up out of nowhere, with no background and no evidence of the evolution of the necessary architectural skills. Strangest of all, the German Archaeological Institute also suspects that Göbekli Tepe functioned as a center of innovation, from which knowledge of agriculture was distributed to a population that hitherto had consisted only of nomadic hunter-gatherers. Rather than a sudden, mysteriously precocious invention 7,000 years ahead of its time, what happened at Göbekli Tepe looks to me much more like a transfer of technology from the survivors of a lost civilization who already knew how to work megaliths on a grand scale and who already fully understood agriculture. Prior to the excavation of Göbekli Tepe, we would have had no context to understand the newly discovered megalithic site shown in this slide. It's submerged to a depth of 40 meters beneath the Mediterranean and was last above water more than 9,000 years ago. We don't know how long the site stood there before the rising seas covered it. Since the early 1990s, question marks have been raised over the age of the Great Sphinx of Giza in Egypt. Egyptologists think it's about 4,500 years old, although there's not a shred of inscription evidence to support this date. Independent researcher John Anthony West and Robert Schoch, professor of geology at Boston University, have made a case that the Sphinx must be much older than that. Based on its distinctive pattern of erosion, Schoch argues that the Sphinx was subjected to a very long period of heavy rainfall, and such rains have not fallen in Egypt in the past 5,000 years. Indeed, to find the kind of heavy rains in Egypt that could have cut these deep vertical fissures, characteristic of precipitation-induced weathering, you have to go back to the climatic disturbances of the Younger Dryas between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. When Schoch and West first put their case forward, it was dismissed by Egyptologists on the grounds that no other megalithic sites in the world date back to that period. But that was in 1992, when you could still say such things. Subsequently, in the second half of the 1990s, excavations began at Göbekli Tepe, proving it to be 11,600 years old. Needless to say, if you can make Göbekli Tepe, you can make the Sphinx. The two sites aren't even that far apart. So, in summary, I suggest, though most of the later construction is of high quality, that the edifice of our past, built by historians and archaeologists, stands on foundations that are likely to prove defective and dangerously unsound. An extinction-level cataclysm occurred on our planet between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. The event was global in its consequences, and it affected mankind profoundly. Because the scientific evidence that proved it happened has only begun to emerge since 2007, and because its implications have not yet been taken into account at all by historians and archaeologists, we are obliged to contemplate the possibility that everything we've been taught about the origins of civilization could be wrong. Thank you.
From the top of the ridge where you see the agriculture and the landscape down to the rivers, about 1,000 feet.
Whoa.
So you basically have to picture you've got this huge sheet of water, 300 to 400 feet deep. It's rushing over and it finds the lowest spot within this ridge, and that's where it starts focusing its energy. And as it does, it begins to just strip away the rock. Now what you're looking at here is this cataract complex is about 5 miles across. And the water came, and you see you've got those kind of curved finger lakes at the top.
And those tunnels.
Those are potholes.
That's insane.
Potholes are formed by underwater turbulence. And in a flood this swiftly moving with this much turbulence, you literally have vorticular eddies, high intensity, high amplitude, high energy, underwater tornadoes, literally underwater tornadoes. Now these underwater tornadoes are typically, in this case, about a half a mile wide.
Oh my God.
And they're spinning at a high rate of speed, and they're right there, they're probably 600 feet deep. Because the water pouring over the ridge is at least 200, and you can see what it's done to the bedrock.
Anybody listening, you gotta look at this. You have to look at this and then listen to the scale.
This is a gigantic scar in the landscape, of which there are hundreds around this
and
region.
the exact location, Randall?
This is Potholes Cataract,
Right.
the exact location.
Somebody wants to get to it, which we're in Washington State still?
Yes, we're in Washington State. Central Washington. It's going to be right on the Columbia River, just below Wenatchee.
Okay, where we
Washington.
saw that huge erratic, that
Yes, very
giant
close.
18,000-ton boulder brought there, enchained in an iceberg, an iceberg floating on the flood, an iceberg the size of an oil tanker carrying an 18,000-ton boulder, carried on the flood, grounds 700 feet up a valley side, rests there as the floodwaters recede, the ice melts away, and the boulder is left sitting there.
We're going to look at a
Holy
picture
shit.
of that boulder in a second.
What do the people back in this part of the country, what do they think about this?
Well, you know, they're only just catching on to what they're sitting on top of.
Jesus.
There you get a sense of the rock blade.
Well, there you get a sense of what the volume of water must have looked like when it was rushing through there.
Right, and see, this is just,
Holy shit.
we've looked at two features now, Camas Prairie and Potholes Cataract. We could sit here for the next 10 hours looking at dozens and dozens of these mega features. And you look at, there's a whole bar. This is a gravel bar down here.
Over there.
And
Okay.
look at, see the giant ripples
Yeah.
on it? You see those?
Yeah.
I've never seen those reported in the literature. It may be that nobody's ever really seen them before.
Or no one's ever paid attention.
Nobody's ever paid attention, but there they are.
So what does mainstream science use to describe this sort of, or mainstream archaeology use to describe these features?
This would be geology. Well,
Did I say
catastrophic
archaeology?
flooding.
Yeah, what would they, so they believe this is catastrophic flooding as
Oh,
well.
yeah.
They just think it's a slower.
They think it's lots of small catastrophic floods. They're not one big catastrophic flood.
And what kind of timeline are these geologists putting on this?
Oh, 2,000 or 3,000 years.
Yeah.
And why do they think that?
Well, because of the ice dammed model and how much time it would take. See, it gets complicated.
And because until the comet research, there was no credible source of heat that could melt that amount of ice and cause that.
Right.
Now that's the new factor that's come into the
Right.
equation.
Now you look at the people standing on the cliff edge there, the edge of the rock. But do you see them down there?
Yeah.
So now you get the sense of
Scale.
what would survive again in the aftermath.
Not
of
that dude.
No, not that dude. Not that dude. Or
First of all, it helped me to understand that in dealing with history, and particularly in dealing with prehistory, there is a difference because history is based primarily upon written documents. And prehistory, you're dealing with objects, artifacts that are dug up out of the ground. I began to realize how ideological this is. That actually when I'm dealing with academics, with archaeologists or professional skeptics of any kind, I'm dealing with people who already have an ideological position. And that ideological position is confronted by the position I take. So in an ideological war, what you try to do is to destroy your opponent in any way, fair or foul. And it's helped me to understand that there is an ideological war over our past. For example, when it comes to large-scale animal extinctions, which happened at the end of the Ice Age, what they call the megafauna, the mammoths, the mastodons, the saber-toothed tigers, the giant sloths, all of these creatures were in the world until 12,800 years ago, and then they were gone overnight. Very, very radical, rapid change. Now, the mainstream, for some reason in this ideology, doesn't like cataclysms. It doesn't like cataclysmic events. It doesn't want to think that that cataclysms have played a role in the human story. So seeking for a way to explain the disappearance of the megafauna, the natural option for mainstream archaeologists is to say, oh, that was human predation that did it. That was human hunting that did it. And suddenly we're required to picture a group of hunter-gatherers who are so incredibly efficient and so ruthless that they wipe out the entire megafauna of, for example, North America in a matter of months. I don't know any hunter-gatherer community that behaves that way. They respect their prey. They live with them. They codepend upon them. They don't wipe them out. What does wipe them out is a giant comet impact, which melts the ice sheets and causes huge flooding over North America. So there's a tendency in the study of prehistory to want to keep the past kind of nice and calm and just the way it is now. There's even a word for it. It's called uniformitarianism. And it's a doctrine that things should have unfolded in the past, much in the way that we see them unfolding now. So if we don't have any giant cataclysms happening in the earth now, then there wouldn't have been any cataclysms in the past. And yeah, we know about the dinosaurs and they were made extinct by an asteroid, but that was 65 million years ago. Surely within the human story there's been no such thing. And as a result, scholars who attempt to investigate the possibility of a past cataclysm often find themselves in the crosshairs of very vicious attacks from their colleagues, as though somehow they're upsetting the apple cart in some way, and as though we shouldn't think about these things. I don't think that it's deliberate, planned censorship.
Right.
I think it's the mindset of the individuals who we have entrusted with interpreting our history for us. And that is a mindset that is troubled by cataclysms. It doesn't want them to have happened, whether consciously or subconsciously, and looks for other reasons to explain why things are the way they are.
Yeah, it's important you say that, because it's not, in your mind, that conspiracy. It's
I
just
don't think so.
a natural tendency for them to shy away from these things.
Yes.
Because also, keeping things in the status quo keeps everything
Yes.
the way it should be.
Yes.
Keeps them in their same jobs, their institutions alive.
Absolutely.
And so they just naturally become uncomfortable and resist when they hear these new theories.
Very much so. And this is a classic example that I go into in this new book of archaeology going radically, drastically wrong. Even in 1995, the notion of a lost civilization was not a new idea. That notion has been around for a very long time. We can take that notion actually back thousands and thousands of years. The most famous example is Plato, the Greek philosopher Plato, who gave us the story of Atlantis. From Plato comes the story of Atlantis, a great advanced civilization which had navigating and seafaring skills, which could explore the world, which built gigantic buildings, which had advanced knowledge in every area, which was prosperous and powerful. But then Plato says that corruption crept into this society, that it became cruel and avaricious, it became greedy, it began to impose its power around the world. And he has a very ringing phrase. He said that Atlantis ceased to wear its prosperity with moderation. And the suggestion is that it's this hubris, this conceit of Atlantis, that it had become so sure of itself that somehow the universe struck it down, and we have the cataclysm of flood and disaster, and that Atlantis is submerged beneath the waves. Now, of course, the view of historians and academics is that Plato's story is just made up. He just made it up to make some political or philosophical point. But this cannot be so. That view can't be right. I was very suspicious of that view the first time I heard it from a mainstream historian. Why are they saying that Plato made this up? Plato repeatedly states that it is a true story. And as we look into it further, we find something else, that Plato puts a date on the destruction of Atlantis. He says Atlantis was submerged beneath the waves in a huge global cataclysm 9,000 years before the time of Solon. We know Solon, we know who he was. Solon was a famous Greek lawmaker. He was an ancestor of Plato, as a matter of fact, about 200 years before Plato. And around 600 BC, Solon, the great Greek lawmaker, made a visit to Egypt. And in Egypt, the priests at a temple of Sais in the Delta told him the story of Atlantis, and they said that it was written on the walls of the temple. And he said, when did this happen? When was this great civilization destroyed? And they said 9,000 years ago, and that was in 600 BC. So that's 9,600 BC in our calendar. That's 11,600 years ago.
Plato is telling us a great civilization was destroyed in a global cataclysm of flood 11,600 years ago. He's laughed at by all academics and historians. But then geology comes along, and lo and behold, what do we find? 11,600 years ago is a truly cataclysmic episode in geological history. It's called Meltwater Pulse 1b. We have a massive rise in sea level as the ice sheets on North America and Northern Europe just crumble and collapse into the ocean. If Plato made the whole thing up, he was just astonishingly on the money with the latest geology. And I think that we really have to reconsider our attitudes to these stories that have come down to us from the past. Academics have been too quick to dismiss them, too quick to say, oh, we've figured the whole story out, there's no mystery there. Maybe there's a huge mystery there. Maybe we should listen to these clues and hints from the past that speak of a great civilization. So when I published Fingerprints of the Gods in 1995, it was at the end of a long lineage going back to Plato and before, and of course famously Ignatius Donnelly in the 1900s, the early 1900s and late 1800s wrote Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, which was a huge investigation of Atlantis. So this subject has been tackled again and again and again. And again, mainstream academia has said, no, it's impossible, there could be no lost civilization, we know everything about the past, and it's been dismissed. But the problem is that new evidence keeps coming out, which can't be explained by the existing historical model. New evidence that just doesn't fit the picture. And my sense is that this evidence is now becoming overwhelming, and that we're reaching a tipping point. Maybe not this year, maybe not next year. But within our lifetimes, we are going to see a completely new understanding of the past, a radical revisioning of the past, and therefore of our place in the world as well. We talked at the beginning of this discussion about Plato's Atlantis story and how he said that Atlantis went down 11,600 years ago. That's the date of the foundation of Göbekli Tepe. Very set, very clear, absolutely founded 11,600 years ago, exactly the date that Plato gives for the ending of Atlantis. And Göbekli Tepe doesn't fit. It just comes out of nowhere, out of nowhere. We understand a site like Stonehenge. Makes perfect sense. About 4,500 years old, Stonehenge. We know that it was centered in an agricultural community which generated surpluses. Those surpluses allowed labor to be freed. You could fund people to become astronomers or architects or engineers. They need to be producing all the time. So we can understand the social and economic context in which a huge megalithic site like Stonehenge emerged. Go to Göbekli Tepe, you're 7,000 years earlier. The entire area prior to the appearance of Göbekli Tepe is inhabited only by hunter-gatherers. There's no agriculture whatsoever. They haven't built anything ever. And then suddenly, without any background or any preparation, appears this huge megalithic site, which is incredibly sophisticated. Turns out, because a large part of it's still under the ground, seen with ground-penetrating radar, that the whole site is actually 50 times bigger than Stonehenge and 7,000 years older. So how do we account for this? Did a group of hunter-gatherers in Turkey wake up one morning, magically inspired, that they suddenly knew how to cut and quarry stone, move blocks weighing in some cases up to 50 tons, create gigantic stone circles in an area with no water, involving bringing a labor force and organizing that labor force and feeding and watering them, to create the world's first perfectly north-south aligned building, which involves accurate astronomy, to do all of that, and at the same time to invent agriculture, because at the same moment that Göbekli Tepe pops up, suddenly agriculture appears in that same region of Turkey. It's obvious to me that that wasn't a group of hunter-gatherers who woke up one morning suddenly equipped with the skills. What we're looking at is a transfer of technology. This was the survivors of a lost civilization. They already knew how to create megaliths. They already knew how to do agriculture. They settled amongst a hunter-gatherer people who they may have reached out to before. They settled amongst them and they created this project. And this project was to restart their civilization. It didn't quite work, but they got somewhere. They created this huge site, they invented agriculture. We are all the descendants of that. All of the agriculture in the world today began around Göbekli Tepe 11,600 years ago. First of all, it's important to understand that the earth changes that took place between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago were utterly cataclysmic, beyond all imagining. The science is now in, it's very clear. We had an interaction with the fragments of a very large comet, a giant comet, which originally may have been as much as 100 miles in diameter. It was drawn into the inner solar system about 20,000 years ago. These things come from very far away. They come from a place called the Oort cloud, which is almost light year away. It's so far away. It's so far away. A huge sphere of trillions of comets in the very outer solar system. But disturbances, gravitational disturbances, can send comets out of those safe orbits, winging in towards the inner solar system. It happens from time to time. And the evidence now is that we got one of those, a big one, about 100 miles in diameter, about 20,000 years ago. It entered an orbit that crosses the orbit of the Earth. And for the next 8,000 years, nothing bad happened. They missed each other. But 12,800 years ago, at least 8 pieces of this large comet, some of them up to a mile in diameter, hit the Earth. 50 million square kilometers of the Earth's surface was devastated by this comet impact. Sea levels rose rapidly, and the Earth's climate plunged into a dreadful deep freeze that lasted 1,200 years. This event was of a scale, of a magnitude, that is quite capable of having wiped out almost all traces of a former civilization. And that's why I think again about what Plato had to say, and I think also about our civilization, because we feel that we've got it all sorted out. We are very proud of our technology, and it is a stunning technology. There's no doubt about it. We're very proud of it. But we have not created a strong society. Those technologies work through interactions, through networks, through connections. Nobody has all the pieces of the puzzle. Everybody has a little bit of the puzzle, and we cooperate together and we pool our skills, and we've created this world. But if you were to have a massive cataclysmic event occurring, if, for example, we were to face another comet impact as we did 12,800 years ago, then all the fragile networks that tie our society together would fall apart. And I don't believe that our civilization would survive such a cataclysm. Human beings would definitely survive, but our civilization would not survive because, contrary to its surface appearances, it's actually very fragile and very easily broken. Those who would survive the cataclysm would be hunter-gatherers, people like the Kalahari Bushmen or the hunter-gatherers of the Amazon basin. They would hardly notice it, as a matter of fact. Hunter-gatherers are in the business of survival in very difficult circumstances, and they would get through it. We would not. Very few people in modern Western technological society know how to survive at all. We have no survival skills whatsoever. Food supply into our cities is on a just-in-time basis, 2-3 days maximum food supply in a city, then you have people starving. How rapidly and radically this civilization would fall apart faced by a gigantic cataclysm, it's almost impossible to describe. The people who would carry the human story forward would be the hunter-gatherers. And 10,000 years from now, their descendants might tell a story about how there had been a time when there was a great civilization on this earth. So advanced, its powers were almost miraculous. Do you know, they could send people to the moon. They could fly around the world. They could speak to each other on other sides of the planet. But something went wrong. They became cruel. They became arrogant. They began to impose their will on others. They ceased to wear their prosperity with moderation, and the universe struck them down. I think there's a message in the Atlantis story for our civilization. We should stop being so fucking arrogant and proud in our achievements. We should show some humility, and we should learn the lessons of the past.